thank you for having me this morning here. I'm really, really happy to be back in Wellington. It's been quite a few years. And certainly over the last few years, I heard a lot about how much good technology is happening in New Zealand. So using the opportunity to be here, and I'm going to meet a couple of my work colleagues tomorrow, super, super excited to be part of the community and share a little bit about what gets me excited at the moment. So this morning, I will talk about the developer experience and platform engineering, and why, while I'm a DevOps guy, why I think this is actually something that is a little bit different to the trends that we've seen in the past, and why I think everyone should care. So I don't probably have to convince anyone that software is important. You would have heard these things from Mark and Trace and Satya about software is eating the world and how every company is a software company. That is pretty obvious. The implications of that, I think, are something that organizations are still struggling a little bit with. And for me, it comes down to these three things. One is that software engineers are your key employees, right? They're not just back of house. Like it's this, I will admit, so I was all through my career an engineer, so I'm a little bit biased, tiny bit biased. But my jobs when I started in the industry were like manual testing and deployments and all these kind of things that are not really super exciting. Like they're not what you want to do. And I think now we're at the point where people appreciate that if you have engineers, you should use them to solve business problems, not do this kind of toil about manual testing, manual deployments, manual infrastructure creation, connecting network cables, all the stuff that I did when I started. The second thing is that we have an increasing complexity in software delivery. I mean, we are the cloud native con, and BMK talk about open source. Like, there's so much more complexity now in IT delivery than ever before. When I joined my first job and we had a quarterly release on the weekend, you could still count the things that you had to do. It was a lot. Like, you had like a wall with a project plan lined out and it had like names against it and you would tick that off. But you could kind of fathom that. When you now see it, the speed that we are deploying multiple times a day, hundreds of components, thousands of components, like, it has become a lot more complex. And then we add to this, and I will admit that me personally and our community contributed to it. We went through this phase where we federated out everything. Like Agile and DevOps came up and we're like, let's empower all the engineers. Everyone can choose their own tools, their own processes. And so we had a proliferation of tools, and I will show a couple of things about this during the talk. But all this stuff made it more complex and harder to manage. It's more powerful, it's the right thing to do, but how do we control this power? Right? It's the Spider-Man quote. And then the last thing is that we are dealing with a more liquid workforce, right? We have more contractors, we have people who work from home. I don't know how it is here in New Zealand, but like in Sydney and in Melbourne, where I spend most of my time, it is pretty hard to even find coffee after 3 p.m. because there's not a lot of people around, right? And so it's probably the same here, right? So we have to deal with that as well. So you can't just tap someone on the shoulder, hey, how is this going? How's the release going? You don't have this opportunity anymore. And if you're like me, working from home, Teams calls, you actually are on Team calls all day, and you get less done. But that means for every 5-minute conversation, you're scheduling a 20-minute Teams call. Seems odd, but that's what's happening. Right? And then you still spend the 20 minutes because, hey, it's in the calendar. You might as well spend that time. So I think both platform engineering and a focus on developer experience is really an answer to these kind of 3 different trends that we're dealing with. So a bit of terminology. I think we all struggle a bit with all the different things overlapping. Here's how I define these 2 things. The developer experience is really focused on the person in front of the PC. Then we have platform engineering, which is really building the stuff that the person interacts with. You can see it on the right-hand side. And then you have this really annoying thing in the middle. Most organizations work with something like VDI and Citrix and so forth. That is part of the experience. It usually doesn't help the experience, right? And I'm not going to go into details on that, but it's something that you need to think about. All right. So let's start on the developer itself. This I stole from a website that I really love, Sketchplanations, where I learn something new every week in a really nice cartoony format. But this is Dan Pink. Many of you might have seen this before or heard about it, but this is what motivates knowledge workers. And ultimately, engineers are knowledge workers, right? It's purpose, mastery, and autonomy. Now, that kind of makes sense when you think about it, and there's a lot of research into how basically that is what gets people up in the morning, why you're going to work. Now, I think the success of cloud and agile and DevOps and all those things is actually based on this. So I'll show you, right? So breaking this down into why these things are helpful, so think about purpose. Purpose is you turning up, not just executing the manual test script that someone gave you, not just installing something on a server, not just creating an instance of a database in the cloud. Yeah? And we are empowering purpose by making sure that people understand what problem they are solving. Right? So think about this movement from project to product. Think about Agile, where you're actually implementing a user story as a team and not just executing a task. Like all of that helps you create purpose. The next thing is autonomy. And autonomy is often misunderstood. Right? Autonomy, I mean, you would have heard about full stack engineers and those kind of things. Like, who here is a full stack engineer? Oh, there's a couple of hands. Good. Like, I don't actually believe they exist, to be honest. So glad to meet one. Right? Because that's nonsense, right? Like, you know, I'll show you later. Like, there's no way you can be a full stack engineer. You can be a full stack engineer if your stack is really small. Right? But big organizations and any organization at any scale that can actually achieve something has a massive stack. So that doesn't exist. So autonomy is not about that. Autonomy is also not about full stack teams, even though they might exist or they have a better chance of existing. Right? But are you really going to deploy a DBA into a front-end team just so that they have some database skills? And then this DBA sits there for a long time. They're now autonomous. You know, you can make your database changes. There's once in a week that you need him, and the rest of the week he's going to do something for other teams. That's also not autonomy. But autonomy we can enable if you think about what does this team try to achieve, and how many times do they have to talk to a different team, how many snow tickets do they create, how many Jira tickets do they have to create to get something done. Right? So if we think about our processes and we're improving them, that improves the developer experience, but it also requires us to have a platform that these people can interact with that makes it easy for them. The other thing about autonomy is, so I have a son, 6 years now, still not drinking alcohol, just to be clear. And I want him to be a really, really responsible adult when he grows up. Right? And so I would love for him to be autonomous. But I don't do that by sending him into the kitchen right now and say, have a meal. You know what's going to happen if I send my son right now in the kitchen and say, have a meal? He knows where the snack drawer is. He's going to go straight for that, and there's this kind of colorful M&M box, which is actually mine. But he's going to go straight for that, and like big hands, and right? And that's not because he's not, like, he can't be autonomous. He will be later, but he has to first learn this. And if I go into an organization now and say, you shall be autonomous, you now empower teams, is it a surprise that the teams don't understand what the total cost of ownership is of creating yet another testing framework, and of, you know, that they don't understand all the security restrictions that we have, et cetera, et cetera? And autonomy is not just let people loose. It is make it easy for them to do the right thing and make it really hard for them to make a mistake. Right? It's a systematic thing. It's, you know, where blameless postmortems and so forth come from. And then the last one is mastery. And mastery is really fast feedback. Right? And this is, you know, from a tech perspective, we talk about test automation and those kind of things. But it's also from a business perspective. Is the feature that I'm building actually useful? I assume that some of you here build features of some ilk. How often do you actually know that this thing is being used? Do you actually measure that someone is pressing the button that you've created? Right? Is anyone actually using the report that you're sending out? Right? You can only create mastery for your business if you get feedback. All right. So this is kind of an illustration. It's a nice little slide that talks you kind of through kind of end-to-end developer experience. It's from a colleague of mine. But I think it's a really good articulation. Like, there's the left-hand side, which is kind of seamless onboarding, and we all know how painful that can be. I worked with an organization where it took 8 weeks for someone to get access to the system. Not to get a user account. It's just to then get the access to the systems, which had to, like, all kind of RACFs and all kind of things. And then you have in the middle, you have the kind of marketplace. That's a kind of platform engineering side where you get access to the right capabilities. But then there's a thing on the right-hand side as well, which is how do you actually create a developer culture? Right? If every organization is a software organization, but your organization wasn't a software organization when it started, that means you have to do a little bit of work on the culture. Create a career path for engineers, move things away from just being you know, the person in the back of house to bring them forward to allow them to solve business problems. These are the kind of different building blocks. And you know, there's this organizational thing where I talked about before, kind of moving from project to product, verticalization, end-to-end ownership of something. There's culture, like the engineering culture, the allowing people to learn and make safe mistakes. Don't fail fast. No organization is going to pay you to fail, but learn safely. We have the developer career model. And then there's the two other things. Right? There's the developer journey, and there's the systems and tools. I'll talk a little bit more about the developer journey and the systems of tools now, because I think that's really where that's where the techies want to talk. And I've been techie long enough that I used to think that if I just built the better mousetrap, every problem will be solved. Right? And you probably have been there, right? Where your test automation framework or your cloud landing zone is the best thing ever, and it's going to be so easy for everyone to use, and then you get frustrated that everyone else doesn't understand you. Right? I've been there. I've been there. So this is the workflow for developers, and I still haven't seen a good articulation of this, to be honest. I mean, many of you would have been exposed to Scrum and Safe and Disciplined Agile and so forth, Kanban. But ultimately, we haven't really solved yet the problem where there's a development team which will have new things to build. It will have a backflow from production, and then it also has to do tech debt work. And there isn't really a methodology that covers that nicely. Right, which means this whole thing about DevOps and culture and we own everything hasn't still made its way into the main framework that we work with. Right, because they're either building new things, Scrum, kind of planning and iterative planning, or you have flow systems like Kanban. But how to bring them together is still something very contextual to each organization. And actually it gets worse because we are reinforcing those silos. Now, I hope perhaps there's an organization here that has solved this problem. Would love to talk to you. I'm talking to lots of vendors for this. But most organizations, developers go into something like Jira. Ops people go into something like ServiceNow. And business people look at Power BI. So we are reinforcing this. Even if you're the developer and you have end-to-end ownership, if you're clicking into different things and logging into different systems, you realize that you're doing different things. Right? So we're not yet at the kind of seamlessness of people thinking that it's one thing. Like when I wake up in the morning, instead of going into my IDE, I see how my business is performing, how my features are working in production, how many users have interacted with this, whether there's any problems with this, and then all the kind of things that I need to change, whether it being a defect, being it a new change request. Right? I think there's still work for us to do to make this cultural silo broken from a system perspective. Right? And systems, unfortunately, reinforce behaviors. Reinforced behaviors are ultimately what culture is. Right? So we can talk about this, and we can talk about the two pizza teams and put pizzas on the table. But if the developers on this side still log into Jira and the ops guys on that side log into ServiceNow, they know they're different people. Right? And they have different accountabilities. All right, so let's talk a bit about the systems and the tech side of this. So I already spoke a bit about this. I mean, IT delivery has become a lot more complex. And there was a blog post many, many years ago where we talked about microservices, where there was like a thing about like, you have to be this tall to actually use microservices. I mean, you have to organizationally have these capabilities to manage it. I'll give you an example. I was working for a client in South Africa, and that was many years ago. I want to say probably 12 years ago, 10 years ago. And they called me up and said, Mirco, like, can you come over? We have a couple of problems and would love your insights. I'm like, cool, yeah, what are you doing? We built this microservice architecture in the cloud, da, 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 da. I'm like, back then that was not something I had seen a lot. I'm like, not sure I can help that client. Anyway, I flew over, and we sit in a room, and we do this usual thing. I love whiteboards. I draw something on the whiteboard, and what are you guys doing? And then, so how many microservices do you guys have? 6. Okay. So what's your problem? They're really hard to manage. I'm like, how come? Well, we have to manually deploy them, manually test them. They're going to fit into our release calendar, yada, 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 yada. I'm like, well, okay, yes, architecturally you have something small, but you don't really have microservices because you don't have the capability to manage them. Right? And so that is ultimately where we've gotten to. We have all these new powers. But have we managed the complexity? Now, there's this great saying is to err is human. If you want to create a catastrophe, you need automation. Right? I'm not sure whether you've been there. I've been there myself. I remember getting a call from a team in Singapore, from the CIO of a financial services company. And they're like, we have a problem, and very specifically, you have a problem. I'm like, why? Your DevOps team has just deleted our Jenkins server. I'm like, ooh, how come? And basically, we had created beautiful automation for everything, and we had backup of everything other than our Jenkins server. right? And so basically they ran a command. That command basically had a null out onto the root directory and deleted everything there instead of the cache that it was trying to delete. And so we stood there and we realized, well, these are actually production critical systems now. Because guess what happens in an organization that is fully automated on Jenkins where Jenkins breaks? No one has a clue how to deploy something. Like, you can't manually do it anymore. Like, besides the point that you shouldn't, but no one can, right? Because it's completely codified into Jenkins. The people who implemented this are long, long gone, right? And so now these systems are ultimately critical, right? So you are now in a situation where if you get used to deploying like 3 times an hour and this thing breaks, well, you're toast. Like, you're just toast, right? And so there's a new complexity that we are dealing with. And to illustrate that, these are random pictures from the internet on what your DevOps tool could look like, right? This is real. These are all real logos from real companies that have real tools in the DevOps space. Now, are we surprised that organizations struggle to manage this? Right? And I mean, you can imagine how there's a new tool vendor coming in pretty much every quarter saying they have the better mousetrap. And they very often do. But it's very specific. Right? So at the moment, there's a lot of talk, and I spend quite a bit of time with vendors that do kind of engineering insights. Basically taking all the data from your testing tools, your infrastructure tools, your monitoring, et cetera, and correlating that in a way that you get insights, which is powerful, but it's new. And it doesn't really fit in anywhere yet. And there's 3 or 4 or 5 different vendors, and they're all doing it differently. Now, the problem for organizations is not that there's that many tools out there, because that's a good choice. You have a bigger tool belt. You can choose more. The problem is that organizations haven't really spent time to think about what they need. And this is where platform engineering comes in. So with platform engineering, we now see a somewhat structured approach where people try to create reference architectures that exist outside of the vendor landscape, so that you can say, I need these capabilities, and then you can map vendors into it, or tools into it. And I think that's important. Because if you remember what I said before, that these tools are critical to run your business, that means you need to understand them, and you need to have an opinion about them. Right? And then you can choose the right tools to enable that, whether it be open source or whether it be commercial. And here's my attempt at this. There's a company in Germany called Humanitech who are publishing a bunch of their reference. They actually run Platform Engineering Con. Has anyone been to Platform Engineering Con? It's really cool. It's a free conference. They had, I think, about 20,000 people this year, and they share a lot of this kind of stuff, lots of smaller companies, but there's quite a bit of reference material there as well. Anyway, so this is the reference architecture that I use. You can see at the front, at the top, which is the interface to the developer, you see the kind of SDLC management tooling, right? Things like Jira. On the right-hand side, you see the service management platform, things like ServiceNow, and then you have the developer workstation / IDE. So that is the bit where I talk about, I really want to bring this together, that as a developer, I can see both the flow from a development perspective of change, the thing that comes back from production, as well as my business metrics. Then you get on the right-hand side to the operations platform. That's things like observability, where you have your Datadog or whatever you use. And that's where your applications are going to land in, like your services, your microservices, whatever you use. And then you get to this kind of core of the platform. At the bottom, you have your infrastructure, your cloud landing zone, right? And that is ultimately all the capabilities that come from cloud vendors. If you, like myself, have subscribed to Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and their publishing of services, you get an email every fortnight, every month, that has like 160 new services, right? So cloud landing zone is ultimately trying to help manage that for you, curate that, right? Because you can't just let people loose, to my point earlier. And I think it's more frustrating when that specific service gets discontinued and then you're kind of scrambling, like, what am I going to do now? On top of that, so once we have got the infrastructure, and honestly, even if you're still in the data center, that still counts, right? Because you should be able to provide your infrastructure services in exactly the same way, right? They should behave just like any other cloud. On top of that, we have 3 different platforms. We have a data platform. That is both important from a business perspective to create reports, et cetera. It's also important for your development because ultimately this is where you source your test data from. Right? You do the masking, you do the subsetting, all that kind of stuff comes from the data platform. You have the container platform to manage, obviously, containers. And in the middle, you have software engineering. Software engineering is all the kind of core processes and tools, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. And then on top of that, you have your service catalog, the things the developer actually engages with. Now, if you have a reference architecture like this, it doesn't have to be this one. You can now basically have conversations about which capabilities you're building for what. Right? And data is not just data, but it's in the context of what you're using it for. Right? And if you go into the platform engineering, it gets a little bit more complicated. You can see that on the right. I broke this out a little bit more because there's a lot in there. Right? There's all your build tools, your scanning tools, the monitoring, the feature flags, like the whole shebang is in there. And again, having this kind of model at least allows you to say, do I have everything I need? Which, like aboard vendor X, tool Y, like what capabilities does this cover for us? And what do we still have need for? And this stuff is now coming out. Like I think there is, I want to say there's a Gartner version of this. Most tech companies will have something like that. But as an organization, it's important to have language. Right? Because otherwise it's like, well, I'll give you this great example from early on in my career, where I walk into an organization and say like, so what are you guys doing with DevOps? Oh, we're pretty okay here. We're doing continuous integration. Good, nice. How do you know that you're doing continuous integration? Oh, we have Jenkins. Does anyone see anything wrong with that? The obvious questions were then, what are you doing with Jenkins? Oh, we're using that as our build server. It runs every Saturday. Oh, the people were laughing. Correct, that's not continuous integration. Right? But that's the problem that you get when you don't know what capabilities, when you're equating tools to capabilities and not the other way around. Yeah? So if you want to have continuous integration, yes, you can do that with Jenkins. But you also can use Jenkins just for builds. Right? And the same is true for all these cool tools out there. Right? They don't do magic. They only work when you know what capabilities you're using them for. So if you have all that, you need to think about your developers ultimately as your customers. So if you're the lucky team that builds these cool tools, which is where I sit, obviously I'm biased, but building these tools is an incredibly fun thing to do, but you need to treat your developers as customers, as stakeholders. Right? It's not like I'm going to build a better mousetrap, and if you don't understand Helm charts, that's your problem, not mine. Right? That's not how platforms work. You have to understand where they are. You have to pick the teams up where they are in their maturity. And if you're picking up a team that is using the mainframe and building COBOL, they are not at the same as your kind of React developers. Right? So your platform needs to cater to that. If you do this right, you get a whole bunch of benefits, and you see them on the right. Right? It does control things. It does make it easier. If you're doing it right, it should be both pleasant for the developers as well as for the organization. Like security should love to engage with that because you're using, securized templates. Right? The developers should enjoy this because, yes, you gave them a cool UI, but for the more advanced one, you also allow them to directly access the APIs. Yeah? So doing that right really gives a lot of benefits to both. And that means you really need to think about product management. Right? You need to think about the users and use cases. You need to measure which of these features are being used. If you're a big organization, you probably have a lot of tools that you don't even know how many people are still using them, and you're paying licenses for that. Right? So the same is true if you're creating your own platform. You should have people the ability to engage with it and put features into the backlog, feature requests. Right? Contribute. Do it open source. That's a lot harder, to be honest, than a managed platform, but there are organizations who do open source it and get good contribution from them. You want to loosely couple it because, yes, every quarter there's a whole bunch of new tools, so you should be able to replace something with something else. Which leads me to another really, really complex but important point, which is you need to manage the data model. Pretty much every tool has their own data model. Right? And so comparing that is really hard. So you need to figure out how do you create your own data model and then integrate the tools with that. And you do need to create documentation. Like and I've been there, right? The tool is completely intuitive. It is intuitive to you. It is not necessarily intuitive to all the customers out there. Not everyone will understand how the Azure DevOps pipeline works, even though you think it's completely intuitive. They've come from somewhere else, and documentation does a lot of that work for you. So as we're getting into the end, I can't help but getting, I'm a dad, and I had no idea how much that's going to inspire my thinking. This is another thing that I picked up from my son, which is kind of breathing in, breathing out model of relaxing. I think it's actually true for governance as well. So here's the thing. There's always new things coming up. And so the right governance is you let yourself explore, like breathe in, and then you contract it again if there's no extra value being created by a tool, et cetera. So you have this kind of like ever-changing architecture of your platform. If you do this right, you will have a somewhat pleasant experience in the middle. If you don't, you're going to, everyone needs to now use our one tool, and then that won't work, so everyone's going to create their own under the table versions. So you get a plethora, and then everyone's going to say like, oh my God, we have way too many tools, way too many licenses. We need to create a new central one. Avoid that. Breathe in, breathe out, so that you can stay in the middle. So I hope that gave you a bit of an insight why I think platform engineering is a little bit different to DevOps. It does create a bit more extra structure. The developers are important, and yeah, if you want to follow my journey along the way, like I have a blog, as I said before, I wrote a book on related, not on platform engineering, still the core DevOps. And yeah, I'm on LinkedIn and everywhere else. So thank you so much for having me. Absolute pleasure to kick this off today, and I'm very much looking forward to connect with many of you during the day. Thank you.